All right, then let's start because again, today it's intense, but hopefully fun. All right, so today we are going not to start with our usual image of the spike so that you can basically see some variety in my slides. We're going to talk about something a little bit different. So the question of today is, can we build an artificial brain? And we are going to talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep neural network, and we're trying to see if how this can be applied to neuroscience and what type of question or analogies there are between what we have in our skull and what you have right now in front of you. If you remember from the first day and yesterday as well, I told you the 5 goals, if you want, on system neuroscience. That is to understand information coding, understand the neural dynamics, understand how coding and dynamics come together to support behavior. And in the end, it's to create models, mostly in silico, that can reproduce cognitive function. And this is going to be the topic of today. And I will just start with a picture that some of you might know because this is quite famous. Richard Feynman was a great physicist who was an extremely brilliant science communicator. So if you have, in Caltech is just put online Hollis physics lesson. Just look at them, they're really entertaining. And this is the blackboard that he had in his office at the moment of his death. And you see the quote that probably is the most famous attributed to him, that is, what I cannot create, I do not understand. And this is really the principle that has guided or guides people in neuroscience to become computational neuroscience and having the aim and the dream of actually building a synthetic brain, which can be useful for 2 ways, of course. One, to understand, to really test, this is the ultimate benchmark, right? You really can test that you know how the brain works if you can reproduce its function in some ways, but at the same time can use these type of algorithms that you develop to try to understand how the brain works. So we'll see by the end of today how these things, it's not a unidirectional from brain to silico, but also from silico to brain. So the big question is, can we build machines that reproduce human cognitive function? And this is, of course, not something that started now, but guess in which decade it started? You should know, come on. You can also indicate with your hands and with the number of fingers if you don't want. Come on, people. Okay, sleepy today. It started in the 50s, again, as basically almost everything interesting in neuroscience, in which, of course, like Alan Turing started to propose a test to test machine intelligence that was based on the possibility of human to be tricked by a machine to make them think that they were actually human. In the 50s and the 60s was a very hot moment for artificial intelligence. Marvin Minsky, that is the one that I was telling you about when I was talking about the cognitive revolution in neuroscience. So this idea that we can actually understand how the brain works was actually one of the founding father maybe of AI or of disciplines. And fun fact, was the major scientific advisor for Stanley Kubrick when he did 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that movie is really a landmark of sci-fi, but it's like really scientifically grounded with the advices of a great scientist. Anyway, in the 50s, the term artificial intelligence is coined by computer scientists. It stayed within computers to create like industrial robots that are able to replace humans in the assembly line, or chatbots that are able to make conversation with human, to basically like try to show that some cognitive function can be replicated in a machine. After the 60s, there was what is known as AI winter, because there was many false leads and different paths that really didn't lead anywhere. There was a big, let's say, loss of faith in the approach of the fact that that AI could actually be something achievable. And the interest picked up again in 1997. when IBM developed a computer, but mostly like an algorithm and software that beat the leading, at the moment world chess champion Garry Kasparov. And I'm reading the biography of this thing that is called Deep Thinking from Kasparov. It's a really entertaining book because it shows you a little bit of, like, okay, I don't feel so bad anymore that I was the first human to be beaten by a machine at chess, seeing what machine have been done after that. And from the 90s, we really have an explosion of this. IBM really rebranded itself after Deep Blue, but also we have a lot of other things like the invention of robots that can reproduce some sort of emotional intelligence to understand at least what type of emotions are going on in the mind of the people that this robot interacts to. There is Roomba, which is probably not like maybe the pinnacle of robot, but it's really helpful. And then we come to the 2010 and the last 10 years in which things have progressed at a speed that is staggering. We have the first basically intelligent the virtual assistant like Siri and Alexa and whatever you want to call them. Then they have 2017, but mostly 2016, when we have really a pinnacle of AI. In March of 2016, the 18 times Go champion Lee Sedol was beaten at a very interesting match held, I think, in South Korea, if I remember correctly, by AlphaGo, an algorithm developed by DeepMind in London. There is an amazing documentary that goes with it. DeepMind just released it on YouTube for free. It was used to be on Netflix. Just watch it. It's very entertaining. It's really 1 hour and a half that it's worth spending. However, people both with Kasparov and with Lee Sedol and the winner at Go, they were basically like making a big objection to the fact that actually really the machine was an intelligent being by saying that maybe they just used brute force. They calculated all the possible position in which the element of chess and the element of Go could be put on their board and selected one that was the most promising. This type of objection, if you understand the objection, right? Like, machines are very powerful at calculating stuff. We know it from the 50s. Maybe what they do is just that they calculate everything at once, and that's why they're better, but they're not really smart to decide which move is the best at any particular moment. While this objection was consistent for chess, which is quote unquote a simple game, the number of possible board configuration is Go is 10 to the 170, which is more than the number of atoms in the known universe. This is an estimate, of course. But you can see that the number of different positions that you have at Go is so high that an approach based on brute force was very, very unlikely for the match of DeepMind, of AlphaGo, against Lee Sedol. What I really think is the breakthrough that really made me think, okay, this is really serious. Like, this is really a new era that we are entering. Happened actually the year after. The year after, there was an improvement of AlphaGo that was called AlphaGo Zero, who learns the game of Go on its own and becomes better than AlphaGo itself, which at that time, because it beat Lee Sedol, was the reigning algorithm, right? So you have to imagine that the previous one, AlphaGo, had been programmed to play Go and was playing Go very well. And you're like, this is a machine that actually, okay, has been programmed for something and can do that something extremely well. AlphaGo Zero, through a process that goes via self-play, first of all, was very fast. And second of all, did learn the game of Go on its own by playing against itself, learning the rules, learning the best configuration, learning how to assign, let's say, a higher weight or a higher reward to move that would lead the software toward the victory, and then beat the algorithm that moment was the strongest in circulation. This, to me, is really a pinnacle or the real clear exhibition that at least one cognitive function that is learning something has been really replicated into a machine that is AlphaGo Zero. So machine can improve autonomously through experience without being specifically programmed for a task, but the task of learning itself. Of course, you had to program AlphaGo Zero to say, okay, we need to learn a specific task. And this starts, if you want to discuss an evolutionary approach to study the brain, that we can ask ourselves, which are the tasks by which evolution has programmed our brain. Learning is definitely one of that. We start to do it from the beginning of our birth on. Yeah, everything else is content that we had through experience. But this is philosophy. If you want to go, let's talk about during the break. However, this really can be considered the pinnacle of machine learning, in my opinion, and it's one of the best, of the most important frontier of research at the moment. Let me clarify 1 second the terminology, because people take it wrong many, many times. They think that AI and machine learning are something that are basically like mutually exclusive. I've read headlines of newspapers that would say machine learning will replace AI. In reality, machine learning is a part of what we define as artificial intelligence. In artificial intelligence, we have dozens of different machine learning paradigms that are, again, algorithm that basically learn to execute a task without being specifically programmed to perform that specific task. What we're going to talk about later in our discussion are neural nets and deep learning, which again can be considered subsets of the machine learning field. So you see there is a hierarchical structure in this that we're going to dive deep to go to the last point of the week and of today, that is deep learning. But all of them are not mutually exclusive things. Literally, they are one the other. So we call artificial intelligence the development of computers that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as vision, speech recognition, decision-making, translation between language, and so on and so forth. We call machine learning the study of computer algorithms that can improve automatically through experience. The definition, learn without being explicitly programmed, is again coming in 1959. Usually, machine learning algorithm builds a mathematical model based on a set of sample data in order to make prediction and decision without being especially told so. So what do we want machines to learn through this machine learning algorithm? Go is really cool. I mean, and you know right now that there is a lot of games that machine learning algorithm can, or algorithm, let's call it like that, can actually play and play better than humans. But what we usually want to do is to solve two classes of problems, which are the main one, which are problem of classification. We want to assign the light green dots to a specific category and the dark green dots to another specific category. So we want to draw a line that separates these two sets of data when we get these sets of data to a machine. So we want to identify patterns of data in our data. The second is regression. We want to understand that there is a relationship between these dots, and we want to draw a line that is able to identify this relationship. So if we say, okay, next time if you get a 120, a dot at 120 in the x dimension, where is it going to fall in the y dimension? You can make prediction. It's going to go more or less around 100. So these are the two processes that are basically like mostly approached by the machine learning world. So why would we want machine to learn? Because everything where a high number of variables of data point must be considered simultaneously to make prediction about the phenomenon, where we want to find optimal strategies to solve tasks when we have a set of data that we cannot really interpret. So there is a lot of application, both in the real world and in science, in which we want to understand something more about data sets that are extremely complex, that our mind really has a difficult time grasping. So today we know that we can use machine learning to build algorithms that identify treatment based on evidence for cancer patients, discover new drugs, infer protein folding structure, process images, drive a car autonomously, decode brain activity, the brain-machine interfaces that we saw already previously, inspect soil samples, and this is what Curiosity does now on Mars, filter spam in your email, choose which are basically like, when you enter a query in Google, predict what you actually mean to look for and give you a series of answers. For these things, we've used machine learning to develop algorithms that can do it. So, so there are, as I was saying before, two edges to this work. On one hand, yes, recreating learning in silico is attractive as a neuroscientist. On the other hand, what we create by this type of exercises, it's really important to have basically like algorithm that work. And here I just want to make a, to specify that, of course, when we're talking about machine, we're not talking about cars. We're talking about most likely algorithm. So that's how you should think about these things. This is an introduction. It's very general. I don't think that should elicit question, but it's, if you have any question, just please let me know, and so that we can move forward to understand how machine learn. All right, so machine learn through three main type of methodologies or processes. We call one supervised learning. There is a teacher that provides a series of examples so that the algorithm can understand how to treat that particular data. The process is, and we're going to see this in detail in a moment, that the goal is to learn a general rule that can map the input to the output. The algorithm as both. It can use a training set of data to actually learn what rule connects inputs and output, and it does so. So that in the end, you can apply to data that are not labeled and they've not yet seen. The second method is called unsupervised learning. The algorithm is given no labeled inputs, but it lives on its own to understand the structure of the inputs. So what it does is, let's see if there are inputs that are basically very, very similar with each other. And if there are inputs that are very, very similar to each other, we cluster them together, we separate from the other, and we create a specific category. So unsupervised learning can be a goal in itself. We can basically discover hidden patterns in our data. If we have a group of pictures, for example, distinguish the one that are of the same subject, or like, for example, Facebook does for the pictures of your for your pictures, right? Like it defines different phases and suggests you that someone could be tagged in your picture. Or it can be a means toward an end, right? You can extract what are the features that makes a certain category that category, and this is important for neuroscience. If you use unsupervised learning methods to actually cluster together neural states, as we are going to see in a few slides, you are able to identify features that are specifically expressed by those neural states. Let's look at it in later on. The last type that we are going to go through is called reinforcement learning, in which the system interacts with an environment, and the goal is to perform an action, to perform something. The system is given feedback by the environment in terms of a reward or a punishment as it navigates the problem space. This is very easy to think about, as we think about the animal. For example, when it was navigating, think about an animal navigating a maze. If you find the right direction and you arrive to the point, you get the reward. If you don't find the right direction and arrive to your goal location, you don't get the reward, which in itself is already a punishment. So you basically have the carrot and the stick of trying to teach the system to always come up with the rule and the way to solve the task that the system is given. We start to talk about this first, the reinforcement learning. We're going to go, let's say, in reverse order. Reinforcement learning, this is a little bit more canonical and more, let's say, rigorous definition, not really mathematically, but like I want you to have a grasp of what these things really do. Reinforcement learning is a technique that allows an agent, and when we talk about agents in computation, in artificial intelligence, you talk about a being that has agency. So someone that can do something, very, very simply put. This agent takes action and interacts with the environment in order to maximize the reward. So basically what it does before, the goal is to reach a task, to get the reward. The environment is able to provide the reward or a punishment based on the action that the reinforcement learning the algorithm performed. And so it goes to maximize this reward or minimize the punishment as it learns. Because there is a constant interaction between the agent and the environment, this is classified as an environment-driven learning. So this is what I was telling you before. The agent first observe and construct a representation of the world that is around itself, of the environment. We call this representation a state. Then it performs an action and observes how its action has changed the environment, which is basically understand what the next state after its action is. And depending on the magnitude and sign of the response of the environment, so the reward or the punishment, the agent will update his policy, which is basically the rationale of his action, in order to do this over and over again to maximize the reward. Because the environment is a dynamic environment, the agent will try to follow the best policy given the current circumstances. And this is actually important because, for example, if you think about an application of reinforcement learning that is teach a car to drive itself, it's actually like one of the most important features. The system needs to look at the environment at every moment and even change the policy that he wants to get to arrive to the specific reward, which is not killing anyone, hopefully, and bringing us safe where we want to go. You might have heard that recently there was sort of a pinnacle of this reinforcement learning. Okay, so the application, let's go with that, is gaming, the inventory management, delivery management, personalized recommendation. These are all things for which reinforcement learning algorithm have been using very effectively. And lately, that's what I was gonna say, you have read that, I don't know if you know this game, I don't because I'm not a gamer, but I hear that this is very, quite a complicated game. Dota 2 may be considered one of the most complicated game out there, and a system, an agent trained through a reinforcement learning paradigm has been able to solve this task and win Dota 2, whatever that means. I don't even know. I think it's a shootout because you see the person here hunky and with weapons, but I honestly have no idea. So reinforcement learning in a nutshell is you get a series of raw data, you give it to an agent, the agent selects an algorithm that defines the best action, performs this action to shape the environment. It gets a reward or a punishment that allows it to understand the action and the state in which the agent lives in, and it does this all over, so on and so forth, until the reward is maximized or the punishment is reduced, so that you can basically get the raw input data and perform the action that you want to do. In this case, you get a series of data points that are all mixed with each other, and you're able to classify these data points in 3 different clusters. So it's very easy. It's driven by the interaction of the agent with the environment. The second class of machine learning methodology, I don't even know what is the correct word for this, if there is like a terminology specific, is unsupervised learning. There is a technique that allows an agent to learn a model that captures meaningful information about the data. You're not given any label to your data. You need to come up with basically like an internal model, or if you want like a solution that is able to cluster together data points that are similar to each other. This is classified as a data-driven learning. There is no teacher, there is no reward or punishment in the term of an interaction with the environment. So that's how unsupervised learning works. So the algorithm is given a set of data without corresponding label. The goal is to discover the group of similar data points, for example, clustering, or to discover a spatial embedding, so a distribution of this data point in space that makes similar points fall by in space. For example, K-mean clustering works like this. You choose that these data should be divided into clusters, and this is sort of an arbitrary decision that you do, but you can do this also in a more systematic way. The system starts to assign each of the objects that it draws the most similar centers, update cluster and distribution based on its assignment and how good he could capture actually things that were similar, to reassign and to come up with division that basically like are able to separate the data point in the representation. So these two are the two clusters that the network assigns. These blue and dark blue are the data points. First, it starts with two random things. It can coordinate, if I group now close to my red dots, how likely it is that I actually get things that are similar in the same place, reassign basically then the probability based on how good it performed, and go on and so forth until it arrives to a conclusion and finds the distinction that puts light blue with light blue and dark blue with dark blue. Assigning something like this, that is classification, is the problem that you're going to solve today with the TensorFlow playground, building your own artificial neural network. Unsupervised learning algorithms do not receive instruction, but they let the algorithm find the output, which means that we need to inspect the quality of the solution. And that's why visualization is very, very important. For example, if you want one big advantage of this unsupervised learning algorithm is you can leave an algorithm do a little bit of work for yourself. If you have a set of data that you don't know what the hell they means or who belongs with whom and so on, you can give this to the algorithm and try to understand if the observation, which observation are actually similar. We're going to see something like this in the application for neuroscience later on. The application are detection of fraud, for example, segmentation of the market, funded biodiversity in an area, object identification, so on and so forth. One example of unsupervised learning is, for example, giving to the algorithm these cartoons for comics and finding that as a solution, the unsupervised learning algorithm puts together ducks with non-ducks. So most likely, I mean, if I need to anthropomorphize what the algorithm did, so everything that has a yellow beak and yellow feet actually goes into the same category, and those are ducks, and these are non-ducks. Obviously, this is also something important that tells you that maybe the category of ducks can be teased apart from other animals because there is a beak and there are yellow feet. So that's the two-edged swords that I was telling you before. Of course, at this moment, the algorithm is completely ignorant about something else, because here you could have divided this in a different way. You could have divided Donald Duck, Daisy Duck, and Mickey Mouse as being Disney characters, and the other two as being non-Disney characters. But of course, the algorithm didn't know. So the only information that the algorithm is available, to the algorithm, is the one that is in the objects that you're looking at. Is there any question about this? Because I'm going a little bit speedy today. I realize I'll slow down a little bit.
I have a question about the reinforcement learning.
Yeah.
I don't know if you mentioned it, but what type of rewards and punishments are there for algorithms?
You'll see it later. It's basically like positive and negative. In the case of, for example, the way in which this will be learned later when you train the algorithm, you try to minimize the difference between a goal and what you actually are calculating. So of course, it's not like you give the food shock or the female, as we saw yesterday, to the mouse, but you give something that basically like a task to do. Like the minimization of an error is usually a good way to symbolize a reward for a machine.
Okay, thanks.
Any other question? Okay, let's go to the last one. Okay, in a nutshell, again, you give the raw data to the algorithm. The algorithm starts to find things that are basically like similar with each other. You don't give any label, and then you get an output that tries to separate the things in different classes. The last class is the one that we call supervised learning algorithm. Is a technique where an agent receives information about the task from a supervisor, which provides a training data sets of labeled example. So it tells you this is, for example, it gives you a picture of an apple and it tells you this is an apple, so that the algorithm can actually modify its weight to basically like arrive to really give the important information, a correct information. So because you know the task, the correlation usually is classified as trust-driven learning. I find it a bit confusing, but we'll see it. Yeah. This is something that you find. In a supervised learning problem, we start with a data set containing lots and lots of examples without associated labels. For example, here we have pictures of dogs and pictures of cats, and you know that these are dogs and these are cats. Another example that is what we are going to use later and see later is that you can have a data set of written digits, like written numbers, with the label, this handwritten 5, it's a 5, this is a 2, this is a 3, and so on and so forth. The algorithm will learn the relationship between the images and the associated label and apply that learned relationship to classify completely new images that don't have labels, that the machine has not seen before. One of the point of the supervised learning algorithm is that they necessitate of large annotated data set to train the algorithm. But once trained, they're really good for image classification and regression. That are the two type of things that we have seen before. That's also one of the reasons why, for example, like this type of approaches have not, two reasons basically are boosting this explosion in artificial intelligence. One is the fact that we have chips and processors that are very, very powerful and can do a lot of computation at the same time. The other is that we are annotating more and more data sets. So the data sets are becoming really important. So your data really matter. That's why, for example, Google, when you do a CAPTCHA thing, when you want to access a website and authenticate yourself, asks you to click on the things that are, for example, a stoplight or that are a stop sign or whatever, because in that way you can label stuff for them, and they can use you freely to actually do their heavy work. Image and speech recognition, spam and fake news recognition, diagnosis of disease based on symptoms are all ways in which supervised learning algorithm can be applied. Lately, there has been a lot of fuss about this. Basically, there's a diagnosis on cancer based on the biopsies, and automatic diagnosis of cancer based on the biopsies. There is a lot of criticism of that approach, but it's not our job to discuss it right now. We can discuss it later if you want. Of course, if you have elements that don't necessarily fall into categories, you might encounter into errors, and it's difficult for, once you train, for example, to recognize one specific category, to have the algorithm identify an extrapolation, a conceptual extrapolation of that category. For example, if you train the algorithm to recognize pups that are small dogs, it's really difficult for it to recognize them kittens, because it doesn't really make the connection. This is the hierarchical or semantic, if you want, category, small, cute elements of the same species. So supervised learning in a nutshell is you give the data, you have a supervisor and a training data sets. This allows the algorithm to optimize the things that he has to optimize, and we'll see later how, and then allows you to give an output with the 3 different categories. I'll put a slide here just because I want you to really capture the difference between these two. A supervised algorithm is given a set of inputs and will be able to tell you dog and cat, because it has been trained on images that were already labeled like that. So it will know the relationship between the image and the label, and will apply this relationship or to predict the label to an image that has never seen before. An unsupervised learning algorithm will basically try to separate images based on features that basically accumulate to each other. And in that case can be used to actually find hidden basically features that in your data sets in this case. Now, of course, this is the first layer. For every type of method, we have multiple ways of algorithm that can be implemented. And I'll just put this here to understand that the part of machine learning is quite a complex field in which have different type of methods, if you want to call them like that. You have reinforcement learning, deep learning, classical learning with unsupervised and supervised. And for every one of these, you have different type, and there are written here in this illustration, few of them, different type of things, that ways in which you can solve that problem. So when you talk about dimensionality reduction, for example, there is an unsupervised learning methods. In classical learning of machine learning, you can see TSNE, PCA, LCA, SVD, LDA, and whatever you can basically put an acronym in. So this is just to guide you through important principle. There is never a sole way to solve the problem in machine learning. There are always several algorithms that you can use and fit, but you have to select the one that fit the best. And we're going to see one moment how do you do it in neuroscience, for example. As a joke, I write that everything can be solved with a neural network, because now it looks like everything is actually phased with neural networks, which is what we're going to talk about later. Now, how can we apply machine learning approach into systems neuroscience? We have been seeing during the second day calcium imaging as a powerful method to record the activity of thousands and thousands of neurons. We have seen during Wednesday the possibility to use the behavior of the animal as a way to actually find what neurons in higher cognitive areas are tuned to, which means that we need to follow thousands of neurons for hours long recording while animals do stuff. We need to put together and correlate variables, a high number of variables, with an incredibly huge amount of data points, which for a simple mind like us humans is actually a mind-boggling type of task. So the ability to produce big data, as you have heard, I'm sure, many times during your course of studying, is forcing us to actually try to find a way to make sense of those data with computational methods. Usually we use this again to do something that we have seen before, to solve classification problems, for example, clustering together observations that might be similar, to use regression that predicts correlation across data points, or to find patterns in the data in a series of technique that is called manifold learning that you're going to see in a moment. So the necessity of using important or heavily computationally based approaches to understand what the brain actually does is something rigid, but it's something extremely important. And that's why in system neuroscience, you see a lot of interaction with computational basically disciplines and computational people that are able to develop novel and always novel algorithms to understand and make sense of the data that you actually are collecting and trying to analyze. One of the mostly and most widely used ways or technique that we use in neuroscience is dimensionality reduction. This is a way in which people try to find something interesting in piles of number, but it's also a way in which you can try to find hidden patterns in your data that might explain what your data are actually telling you. So what dimensionality reduction actually does, it finds one of the best way to represent the high dimensional data sets in a lower dimensional space. To show you what that means, because it's maybe a complex question to unpack, think about this. You see that your hand, think about your hand, it's a three-dimensional object. But if you cast a light behind your hand and you look at the shadow, you can find a projection on your hand, which is a three-dimensional object, onto a two-dimensional surface that recapitulates the most important features of your hand, that there is a palm, that there is a 5 digits to each other. I see people laughing. It's probably funny that it's a hand. Yes. So you can distinguish that this is basically like a hand because it has a palm, it has 5 digits, the thumb is actually smaller and it's opposed to the other 4 ones. So the most important features of your hand are recapitulated in a two-dimensional projection from a three-dimensional object. So you have effectively reduced one dimension in your hand without losing too much of a meaning. Yes, you might lose the fact that there is a certain thickness to your fingers, but the most important features are still there. Why do we need to reduce dimensions? And this is something quite important in all type of computational discipline. It's because we have what we define, or what people define, the curse of dimensionality, meaning that you don't have to think that the number of the complexity of your data sets increases linearly as you increase the dimension. For example, a 2D data set is going to be twice more complex to analyze or more rich than a 2D or 1D data sets. And this is really exemplified by this type of example here. If you have in a line, in one dimension, 10 different locations where your data can be, you have one dimension and 10 possible positions that describes your data sets. If you add one dimension at this point and you have 2 dimensions where your data could be, you start to have 100 possible positions where your data sets could actually be. If you add the third position, the third dimension, what was 100 just 1 second ago has become 1,000. And if you go on and on and on and on with thousands of your data, thousands of data points to actually analyze, you see that the number of dimensions, or the number of possible positions, or the number of possible states in which your variable can be actually increase with an exponential type of curve, which is extremely difficult to actually analyze. So what people try to do is to reduce the dimension of the data sets. And one of the mostly widely used reduction of the dimensional reduction technique that you can think of is principal component analysis. What principal component analysis will do is try to take your distribution of data points, like this one, and rotate it or translate it in a way that basically allows you to define most of the variance of your data along a number of dimensions which is lower than that one that you've had before. For example, you have this two-dimensional spread. You see that if you want to basically distinguish the individual data points, you could rotate this cloud of points so that instead of being this diagonal in this two-dimensional space, you have in this dimensional space right now, and you can distinguish that there is very little information that goes on this new y-axis, but a lot of information that goes on with the first axis. So effectively describe each of these data points, instead of with 2 different coordinates, one for the x and one for the y, with 1 different coordinate. You will have a reduction, of course, in the information of your data sets, because you have lost the fact that these and these are not exactly on the same point, but mostly these are so close to each other in the other dimension that means that they are basically like very, very similar to each other. And you might do basically like, you might be comfortable with losing a little bit of the information that your data set have just for the possibility to interpret these data sets. So if we look at something like if we look at a real world example, you have in this case a 3-dimensional space that you can actually both use to reduce in one dimension as is 2 dimension as we seen before, and this 2 dimension can be further reduced in 1 dimension as you see before. So you can get a lot of dimensionality of reduction just coming from one individual type of transformation that is calculating the principal component of this dataset spread. Principal component seems to be very funny. I don't know what you guys are looking at the screen right now. Anyway, this is a linear way of solving data. It's classified as a linear type of dimensionality reduction technique. And it's very useful for the data sets that I showed you before, but it becomes a little bit less useful when relationship between data points are not linear anymore, meaning that they cannot really be, the dimension cannot be really reduced if you just start to rotate or to translate in a 2-dimensional plane. So sometimes, for example, if you try to reduce with principal component analysis these datasets that you see lives in a 3-dimensional environment, what you get is here. Understanding that there is an S, that these data points create an S, it's extremely difficult from this type of projection. That's why you start to go with non-linear dimensional reduction techniques. I'm not going to go into detail of this. I just want you to know that these type of things exist. And because most of the things that the brain does are actually non-linear, but also most of the things that your gene expression data do, if you're trying to analyze single cell gene expression data sets, are basically nonlinear. You need ways to try to plot data or recapitulate the feature of the data when the data do not live in a plane that you can just rotate and translate. In this case, for example, these data points are living into a circle. If you think and plot only the distance between the Euclidean distance between these data, you find that data point A and data point C fall very close to each other because the projection is actually very close. But then when you actually are able to linearize this circle with a non-linear dimensionality reduction method, you see that these 2 data points fall very far away. So going non-linear in this case would be actually more, give you an answer that is actually more precise than what you would get via a linear method. And for example, you remember, this is the way PCA has solved the complexity of this data set. If you apply non-linear dimensionality reduction techniques, which are all these different parts, you find something very, very similar, very interesting. That is that some of those, actually most of those, will tell you that there is a relationship in these data sets for which the red one are going to be close to the orange one, they're going to be close to the yellow one, they're going to be close to the green one, they're going to be close to the blue one. So the relative distribution of the data is maintained in most of these, better or worse. This is something that depends on the different type of dimensionality reduction technique that you apply, which is a way to show you that between this and this is definitely telling you more about your data sets than a linear dimensionality reduction technique. So if you go back to the map of the machine learning world that I've showed you before, there are lots of technique. You have to try to choose the best to solve the problem of analyzing your data. Okay? Now, in the last 5 to 10 minutes, and then we go for question and a break, I'm just want to show you some real lab application of this type of technologies to neuroscience, because this is something that it's closer to not only the discipline that you're studying this week, which is system neuroscience, but to the lab in general. So the first one, I told you that in the medial entorhinal cortex, I told you on Wednesday, and you should know by now that we have place cells, we have grid cells, sorry, not place cells, speed cells, head direction cells, and border cells. And some of you was asking, how do you know that the place cells is actually tuned to place and it's not tuned to other elements? For example, the speed, for example, time, for example, what the animal is thinking or eating at that moment. Now, for the neurons that have a very specific tuning curve, it's very easy to see, as the one that I showed you, that the cell was actually really firing in only one location or in another location of the space. But there is a lot of cells, especially in higher cortical area, like the entorhinal cortex or the prefrontal cortex, whose firing tuning is not really so tuned to one individual variables, because they might be influenced by multiple variables at the same time. In that case, making sense of those neurons is very difficult. We can use dimensionality reduction technique and modeling type of approaches to try to understand what is the contribution of each individual variable that we can think of to the firing of those neurons. For example, in this case, we can factor how much position, head direction, speed, or theta phase, which is the oscillation that I've been not telling you about for the whole course. We can understand what is the influence of the 4 variables to the firing of one individual neurons. And for that, we use a model that is called generalized linear model. You don't need to know the detail. You don't want to know the detail so far, but you just want to understand that this model is able to give you, what it does is basically predicts if the neuron was modulated by position, what would this firing rate look like, given that the animal moves in space with a certain dynamics? And it assigns a score. It's a lot. Are you able to predict a lot, or are you able not to predict anything? And this is a way in which we can understand the feature of the firing of one neuron and how much those firing is actually tuned to multiple variables, which is the concept of mixed selectivity, which is becoming more and more prominent when we try to understand the neural code of higher areas, like again, the entorhinal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, or the hippocampus. The second application that I want to show you is something that happened quite recently, and it was very, very interesting. There was the development of a new microscope that you most likely have heard about, that is the light sheet microscope, which allowed people in Janelia to record from 80,000 neurons in the zebrafish brain at the same time. This was an incredible feat that was done by Misha Arens and his lab that basically really allowed us to follow all the neurons of the brain, of that small brain at the same time. However, the thing is, how the hell do you make sense of 80,000 things that might change in time in very independent ways, right? How do you find a pattern in your data? To try to understand what pattern the neural activity of these 80,000 neurons had during time and how that correlated to behavior, they use different type of methodologies. They started with principal component analysis, but they use also some nonlinear technique like ISOMAP, for example. And they were able to identify predictable paths along which neural activity of these 80,000 neuron moved, which were correlated with the frequency at which the animal was swimming. So if the animal was swimming faster, you were in a specific state, and by changing the swimming frequency, the animal was basically rotating, or the activity in the brain of the animal was basically rotating and moving along these different states. Different states were created by different groups of neurons that were widely distributed in the brain of the zebrafish, which are one of the best proof of these extended networks that go on within the brain to support one specific cognitive function. So finding a pattern in your data is also one application of these machine learning technologies to neuroscience. Another type of application is trying to basically like increase the statistical power of your really observation. For example, you have the animal is performing a task. There are multiple trials of that specific task. Every trial is a different type of measurement. How can you get rid of the noise of every individual trials given, for example, by internal states or spontaneous activity in a subject in which you don't have so many data points to begin with? For example, when you record from a monkey. Well, you can use, again, a different type of dimensional reduction technology to actually increase the statistical power of your analysis and identify that there are neurons that are specific to changes toward the left and neurons that are specific to changes toward the right of the specific task that you're actually looking. The second to last example, which comes again from the literature, is decoding. You can use machine learning approaches to decode the activity of the neurons. This is, for example, one way in which the data of the head direction of the animal were actually decoded. In this case, you see the activity of neurons in the anterior part of the thalamus, plotted according to a dimensional reduction technology. And by following the movement of the network states, so the activity in the thalamus in time, you see that this defines basically some sort of stereotypes dynamics, stereotypes movement along this particular structure that is, again, a mathematical representation of the network activity, which predict very faithfully the measure change in angle of the head of the animal. So again, I don't want you to know how this is done, but you can see that like by just looking at the neural activity of that particular area and using a dimensionality reduction technique to actually plot and visualize the dynamics of that activity in time, you can decode what the animal is doing, because these neurons are able to encode for the head direction of the animal. The last example is what we are doing in the lab. It's one of the projects in the lab. I've told you on Wednesday that we have this model of the continuous attractor network to explain the emergence of grid cells. And I've told you already that the different parts that you need to have is a rigid connectivity matrix, which is the Mexican hat, which was basically like, I would say the nail in the coffin was something that was published in 2019. So last year, what we were interested in understanding is activity in the entorhinal cortex propagating according to the dynamics that the attractor network would actually predict? That is, if you remember, you see a bump of activity, and this bump of activity moves spontaneously along the network in agreement with the with the movement of the mouse. Again, take this as an example. I don't want you to know the specifics with attractor network. You should know the basic. You should have already played with the basics in your Neuronify example. What we did at that moment was basically to record the activity of hundreds and hundreds of neurons while the mouse was running under the microscope. You see here the animal that is head fixed under the objective in darkness, in a dark corridor, so that there would be no, basically the mouse would be fooled into thinking that it was running, but would not really have a possibility to create a map of the environment where it actually was moving. And to record hundreds of neurons at the same time, we use calcium imaging. So we inject the virus for the expression of GCAM into the middle entorhinal cortex, because the middle entorhinal cortex is actually obstructed by the cerebellum. So we could not image this directly with our objective because it's too deep within the brain. We implant a prism between the forebrain and the cerebellum, so that we can basically use this mirror side to reflect our photons and reach the MEC in a way that allows us to record activity from this neuron. Okay, what we do, we applied a dimensionality. So what we end up was 500 neurons, 400 neurons, 450 neurons at the same time during our half an hour of recording that we're firing. This is a raster plot. This is what I showed you on Monday, so you should know what you do. What this is, sorry. What we did is to use a dimensionality reduction technique to understand if there was a hidden pattern in the activity of this neuron that we could not see. And I basically spare you with the details of this analysis, but what we see, sorry, the animation went blank. What we see when we use this dimensionality reduction technique is indeed that hidden in this activity of this neuron, we find a beautiful pattern that is that there are a group of neurons that are active at the same time, and that are basically like, and that the activity propagates along the network in a way that basically defines continuous progression across the whole entorhinal cortex network. As we would predict, if the network was indeed organized as a continuous attractor and was drifting spontaneously in a mouse that had no way to anchor its representation of space to any landmark. This is also shown here. If you have if you duplicate the same, these things are continuous progression basically if you plot two of these Russell plot one on top of each other, you see how these are continuously continuing. And if you did the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one as well, because what you have is a continuous rotation or drift along a ring type of organization or a ring type of trajectory that basically propagates in time along our recording. And this allows us to identify, and this is really the last thing before the break, to identify the way in which this neuron connectivity might be organized, because the only type of connectivity, not the only, but one of the type of connectivity that could be supporting this type of dynamics is the possibility that these neurons here are able to talk selectively to this neuron here, that are able to talk selectively to this neuron here, and so on and so forth, with basically like trajectories that in this graph approach define a ring along the, what we call manifold of the activity in the MEC. So this was the really last slide of a long and dense presentation. I wanted you to understand how we started trying to recreate machines that were able to think like humans. And we end up using this machine to actually help us understand how the brain thinks itself. It's a very nice circle, if you want, that is starting to be closed. And if you're going to go into science, and we're going to go to elements that are either system neuroscience, but also if you're going to do a path that leads you to be molecular biologists and wanting to analyze structure of proteins to make sense of gene expression profiling, dimensionality reduction techniques and this type of computational approaches are going to be your daily bread and butter. So the earlier you're exposed to these concepts and to the possibility to at least understand their power and the fact that you might and will use it, the better it is. If you're going to go and look for a job into a company, into a pharmaceutical company, and you have skill to apply this methodology to analyze data, you're going to be in high demand. The reason for that is that basically in every field, the number of data that we can now record is getting higher and higher and higher and higher. But we are not yet able to make sense of those data sets in a way that is like just you click the button and you get the answer. You need to tinker and tamper with this type of algorithm to actually be able to analyze them. So this ends the first part, the first lecture, a little bit over time, but we started with questions, so I feel like we're actually on time. But if you have any type of question about, the reason why we would do that, the application about computational algorithm neuroscience, or in other disciplines, please let me know and ask now. All right, there is a question in Slido regarding the exam. It is going to be 50-50 or lectures and lab part. Could you write down a few more questions to get an idea of how it could be? I can give you points on the topics that I will put for my questions in, for sure. The mock part, I can describe you what I would expect you to do. I would expect you not, of course, to know the details of all the things that we have seen during during this week, because it's going to be otherwise something that really escapes the aim of 1 week of block course. This is something to know the details. You would need a full course out of this. But it's going to be something that also keeps you thinking. Like, I might give you a problem, like, that there is a specific area of the brain that is important for the specific type of behavior. How would you go to try to understand its function and or how this area actually supports that behavior? And you by now have heard many ways and different technologies in which you would help, like you would set this up. Because this is a practical course, I'm not going to give you questions that are notionistic. But I'm going to give you a question in which you have to apply the notion that we have discussed about and talked about in a way that allows you to solve a specific, maybe even experimental task. I'm going to give you an example though by the end of the day, so if you want that. So no more question or Slido. Anybody has a question live before we go for the break? Good. Take a coffee and see you back in half an hour. 11.